Good day. British Ministry of Defence, in its latest bulletin, has finally returned to providing us with battlefield reports about the situation on the battlefields in Ukraine. And interestingly enough, it has admitted for the first time that the Russians have been making significant advances towards Bakhmut, this key strategic town, which, as I've said, is the linchpin of the Ukrainian defence system in Donbass. The British Ministry of Defence explains it all in a rather curious way, however. It says that the Russians have made 10 kilometres of advances towards Bakhmut and only 3 kilometres of advances elsewhere in Donbass over the last 30 days. And this, we are told, is the result of a lack of infantry forces at the disposal of the Russian military in Donbass, and is also supposedly less than the Russians almost certainly had intended. Well, of course, these comments actually open up a whole chain of points. First of all, how do we know what exactly the Russians intended or expected to achieve in terms of advances in Donbass? I mean, it may be that they're disappointed by the 10-kilometer advance towards Bakhmut, and that they're disappointed by the 3-kilometer advance to elsewhere in Donbass. But we have no information, no actual information about this, because the Russian General Staff and the Kremlin keep their information secret. I say that, of course, perhaps the British Ministry of Defence has information from its spies or whatever, intelligence, which we don't have. But if so, why do they say that it's only likely that the Russians are disappointed with these advances, instead of simply saying that they are disappointed with these advances? Anyway, the point is a silly one, because of course a 10-kilometer advance or a 3-kilometer advance through very heavy defence lines with lots of trenches, lots of bunkers, lots of positions to capture, might actually be very significant indeed if it is an indication that you are actually cracking through well-defended front lines. And here perhaps I'm going to make a general observation about this war, because this has been, as I've said so many times, its general pattern. The Russians advance up to a defence line, they shell that defence line with their enormous artillery power, they soften up the Ukrainian forces that are defending this defence line, then they send their infantry, then they capture positions, then they redeploy, they bring up more artillery, perhaps redeploy some of the troops that have acted in the first assault, then they move on and crack the next defence line. And of course, during these intervals between the very intense fighting that sometimes takes place and the heavy artillery shelling, that's when the British Ministry of Defence and various Western reporters and commentators tell us that the Russian advance is slow, or stalled, or delayed, or incremental, whatever that means, or was supposed to mean. Whereas in fact, what we are actually seeing is remorseless progress. Now, the other thing about the British Ministry of Defence reports is, of course, they never provide us with any indications of the price Ukraine is paying for its defence of these defence lines. Every so often, the British Ministry of Defence, the United States government, various media commentators, the Ukrainian government, come up with various guesstimates, because that's all they are, of Russian losses. Guesstimates which, in my opinion, are inordinately high. But they never, to any degree, provide us with information about Ukrainian losses. And we know that these losses are extremely high. At one point during the later stages of the battles for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Ukraine was admitting that it was losing 100 men a day in the battles in Donbass. At one point, we were told that it was up to 500 men a day, and this was men killed, and this was information that came from Ukrainian officials. Well, that has stopped. We've not been hearing any more reports about Ukrainian losses, and the British Ministry of Defence, amongst others, never talks about Ukrainian losses. And of course, Ukrainian losses is what ultimately is going to decide this battle. If Ukraine is running out of men, if it's running out of tank forces, and we had that article in Forbes the other day which said that Ukraine's tank forces are now very thin on the ground, and that Ukraine no longer has enough tanks to be able to concentrate an effective and armoured fist in any particular location. If Ukraine is short of artillery, if it's short of missiles, HIMARS missiles, and by the way, a former disillusioned member of the Russian government, Mr. Koch, who now lives in the West and who has taken very strongly the Ukrainian side in this war, has published a rather bitter commentary about the Ukrainian war and about the fact that the Ukrainian government is not providing accurate information about military developments on the ground. This person made the point that the number of HIMARS missile strikes seems to be declining, that there are fewer of them than was the case a few weeks ago, and he's asked why. Anyway, if HIMARS missile strikes are becoming less, if there's fewer multiple rocket launch systems in Ukraine's possession, if its artillery firepower is declining, well, of course, all that is at least as important as whether or not the Russians have advanced 10 kilometers or 3 kilometers, punching holes through heavy Ukrainian defense lines. And whilst I am on the subject of HIMARS, the Russians, as I've said, recently have published claims that they've destroyed another HIMARS system, or at least launch vehicle, though, as I've also previously said, I find it very difficult to make much sense of the picture, of the film of this destruction of this HIMARS missile that has been destroyed. I should say that previously this had been claimed by a Kherson-based news site, but now the Russian authorities themselves seem to have come forward and seem to have corroborated, or at least supported, the claim of this website in Kherson. They too are claiming that this film actually shows a HIMARS launcher being destroyed as a result of a Russian missile strike. Now that brings the total number of HIMARS systems that the Russians have destroyed either to zero. That's what the US and Ukraine are saying. They're saying that no HIMARS systems have been destroyed by the Russians, or 5 verified launchers destroyed by the Russians. That's estimated by Brian Berletich at New Atlas, or perhaps 6, or conceivably even 8. If it is 8, then of course that's half the number of HIMARS systems supplied by the United States to Ukraine. I'm not going to try and give you my own number. I simply don't know. All I will say is that I personally think that the Russian Ministry of Defense is probably more reliable in claiming HIMARS systems destroyed than Ukraine is in denying that any HIMARS systems at all have been destroyed. But as I said, who exactly is telling the truth about all of this? It's difficult to say. Now, that brings me to another topic, which is who is shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. Now, in my previous video, I said that people seem to be, immediate outlets in the West, seem to be going to extraordinary lengths to deny that it was Ukraine that was shelling this nuclear power station. I'm just going to give an example of this in the form of an editorial by the Daily Telegraph, which appeared on the 7th of August. And I'm not going to read the entire editorial because it's behind a paywall, but I'm going to read some of it. And the editorial starts, "Putin's recklessness should alarm us all." And it then goes on to say his irresponsible breach of nuclear safety threatens to inflict his calamity on the rest of Europe. And then the article goes on to say, "For a country that presided over one of the world's worst nuclear power disasters, Russia's latest action in Ukraine is reckless in the extreme. Almost 40 years after the explosion at Chernobyl sent radiation across Europe and beyond, the military action near the Zaporozhye plant is understandably causing alarm." Note the word military action. It doesn't say Russian military action, but the implication of this paragraph is that it is Russian military action, but military action doesn't actually identify it as Russian. And then the Telegraph goes on to say the International Atomic Energy Agency has issued an urgent warning of a very real risk of a nuclear disaster. IAEA Chief Rafael Mariano Grossi said he was extremely concerned by reports of shelling at what is Europe's largest nuclear power plant. Ukraine said parts of the facility had been seriously damaged by Russian military strikes. So this is Rafael Mariano Grossi saying that he's extremely concerned by reports of shelling, but he doesn't say who is shelling. And then we read that Ukraine has said that parts of the facility had been seriously damaged by Russian military strikes. And then the next paragraph goes on to say, the early stages of the conflict were Russia seized the plant in March and retained Ukrainian staff to run it. Kiev says Russian forces are firing rockets at civilian areas from the site. So previous line said Ukraine said parts of the facility had been seriously damaged by Russian military strikes. But the next paragraph says that Kiev says Russian forces are firing rockets at civilian areas from the site. So it seems these military strikes, these Russian military strikes, according to Ukraine, are not at the plant, but from the plant. And then it goes on to say, the Telegraph goes on to say, Moscow says it is the Ukrainians who are hitting the facility in retaliation. But Mr. Grossi said any military fire directed at or from the facility would amount to playing with fire with potentially catastrophic consequences. Now, of course, I should quickly at this point say that the Russians categorically deny that they have been launching missiles from this site, but that's different from saying that they are attacking it, or at least shelling it. But the Russians deny that they're launching missile strikes from the site. And if we read this article carefully, this editorial in the Telegraph carefully, you can see that the Daily Telegraph admits that it isn't the Russians, or seems to be saying that it's not the Russians who are attacking the site, it's the Russians who are using the site in order to shell other locations. It is the Ukrainians who are shelling it, but of course they're attributing all of this to all of this information about the Russians using the site for shelling to Ukraine. So it's clearly a complicated picture, And of course they don't report the denial from the Russians that they are in fact using the site to launch missile strikes on any place. And then we have a long discussion about the Fukushima accident and the Chernobyl accident, which seems frankly of little relevance to what's actually going on at Zaporozhye. Both of these were accidents. They don't involve military activity. But then we go on to read the next paragraph. The consequences of rocket attack on Zaporozhye, whether deliberately targeted or by accident. But who's suggesting that this is an accident? Earlier in the editorial, we see that Kiev says that the Russians are using the Zaporozhye plant to launch strikes from, and the Daily Telegraph appears to be is reporting that the Russians are reporting that the Ukrainians are shelling the site. So nobody's suggesting that there's any kind of accident going on. Anyway, the consequences of rocket attack on Zaporozhye, whether deliberately targeted or by accident, is obvious to anyone, including Vladimir Putin. His inaction of Ukraine, I don't even understand what that means. His inaction of Ukraine has been a disaster for Russia, but this irresponsible breach of nuclear safety threatens to inflict his calamity on the rest of Europe. Perhaps that is his intention. Well, this is an incredibly garbled editorial, to put it mildly. It's not making it clear who's shelling what. It's giving the impression that somehow whatever is happening at Zaporozhye, it is Putin's fault, but it doesn't really explain how. And of course, note that none of this is based on any independent reporting. There's no Western journalists who've actually gone to visit the Zaporozhye site. The IAEA hasn't yet sent inspectors there. We just hear claim and counterclaim by both sides. But even this editorial, that you have to drill hard to find it, ultimately accepts, or seems to come close to accepting, that it's probably Ukraine that is shelling the site, though it claims that the Russians are shelling civilian areas from the nuclear power site, that they're doing so, that claim is again sourced back to Ukraine. This isn't, I think, helping the Western public understand what is going on at this nuclear power plant. Now, there is a very simple way to resolve this problem, and it's an obvious one, and that is that the IAEA should send its people to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to find out what is happening there. But in order for that to happen, those inspectors need to be safe, and that means that whoever is shelling the power plant needs to stop doing so. And as we see, this editorial sort of suggests, even though it doesn't quite say, that it might be Ukraine. And of course, if the Russians are carrying out shelling from the nuclear power plant, then they need to stop, though of course they categorically deny that they are doing so. Now, I'm going to make one further observation. There is no doubt at all that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is being shelled. I mean, that is indisputable. Everybody accepts this. And as we've seen, the editorial, this editorial from the Daily Telegraph, sort of seems to accept, even though it doesn't quite say so, that it's the Ukrainians who are doing the shelling. The only information there is about shelling on civilian areas from this nuclear power plant comes from Ukraine. So Ukraine is both shelling the plant, preventing, which puts any inspectors who might want to go there at risk, and of course it's doing so whilst claiming that the Russians are shelling from this nuclear power plant, The Russians, of course, deny this, but of course, for so long as Ukraine continues to insist on that as being the case and continues to shell the power plant, well, an inspection to verify what's actually going on cannot take place. Now, that, of course, well, you can, I think, work out the implications of this. It certainly seems to me that what Ukraine needs to do is to stop shelling the power plant for a couple of days, let the inspectors go in. If there really are Russian troops there, the inspectors can no doubt confirm that. If there are no Russian troops there, if there's no shelling going on from Zaporozhye, then Ukraine should not continue to inspect. It's going to shell the plant, and of course, if there are Russian troops there, then of course Ukraine can very properly and correctly and legally insist upon them being removed, and of course the entire international community should insist on that. And I've no doubt actually that faced by that kind of pressure, a deeply embarrassed and humiliated Russia would have to remove its troops and its artillery from this site. So it seems to me that the burden here rests with Ukraine. They need to stop the shelling. As I said, I accept the Daily Telegraph doesn't quite say that they are carrying out the shelling, but the implication that they are carrying out the shelling is clear. And they also need to allow the inspectors to come in and find out what's actually happening. And governments around the world, they're really concerned about the fact that there is a risk of a nuclear accident as a result of this shelling, should be telling Ukraine to stop the shelling, so as to allow the inspectors to go in and go in quickly and find out what is really there. Anyway, that's the situation with the Zaporozhye power plant. And I would repeat what I've said in previous programs, that this is, I'm afraid, becoming consistent with a pattern of increasingly reckless actions taken by Ukraine, as it seems that the situation in Donbass becomes increasingly difficult. Well, that's the situation in Donbass, that's the situation at the nuclear power plant. There's also, of course, the great unresolved issue of the great Kherson offensive. And I mentioned this fiery comment by Mr. Koch, this former official of the Russian government, former minister in the Russian government, who's now become disillusioned and taken Ukraine's side. And he asked somewhat bitterly, where is this Kherson offensive? And Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has actually provided a timeline showing how far back Ukraine has been promising a counteroffensive in Kherson and saying that there would be a counteroffensive in Kherson. And he goes back to May. I actually would go back further. I distinctly remember Ukrainian officials talking about a counteroffensive in Kherson region, either at the end of March or the beginning of April, shortly after the Russians began to pull back from Kiev, perhaps even a little before. I seem to remember articles appearing again in the Daily Telegraph suggesting that the Russians were losing their grip on the various cities that they'd encircled, including the cities in the north and including Kherson amongst them. And there was even a picture, this is in March, as I remember, of the administration building in Kherson with a huge Ukrainian flag as an indication that Ukraine was about to recapture Kherson city from the Russians, and that some kind of offensive, Ukrainian offensive against Kherson city was underway. Now, today is the 9th of August. Ukraine has promised this offensive at various times, as I've said, but the implication has been made repeatedly that this offensive would take place in August. And of course, if it doesn't happen in August, if there is no offensive against Kherson city in August, if Kherson city at the end of August, the beginning of September, is still firmly under Russian control, as it is at the moment, then I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I think there will be a loss of credibility, a major loss of credibility. On Ukraine's side, I think many people in the West, many journalists in the West, many commentators in the West, who have been telling us, who have been believing this story about the Kherson counteroffensive, are going to be, frankly, not just disappointed, but more skeptical, seriously more skeptical of Ukrainian claims in future. Now, that, of course, brings us to the question of whether a Kherson offensive is even possible. And Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's actually carried out armoured warfare, has written a whole series of articles suggesting that this is not really a practical proposition, that an attempt to retake Kherson would certainly fail. Well, a lot of the evidence that Ukraine is planning some kind of a counteroffensive against Kherson region seems to relate to the events with the various bridges that crisscross the Dnieper. And yesterday, Ukraine launched another missile strike against the Antonovsky Bridge, the road bridge near Kherson. And again, apparently a HIMARS missile managed to break through the Russian defences and did more damage to the roadway, but failed to do any significant damage to the structure of the bridge itself. And I'm getting increasing information now, what I have always suspected, that the HIMARS rockets, the missiles, HIMARS missiles that Ukraine possesses are simply not powerful enough to carry out significant damage to the structure of the bridge so as to jeopardize the integrity of the bridge. They can do damage to the roadway, but they can't do serious damage to the pylons, and that it would be all but impossible for Ukraine, with the HIMARS missiles that it has, to actually destroy this bridge. Now, there are reports that Ukraine has been seeking the more powerful 300-kilometer ATACMS missiles, which perhaps do have warheads which might be sufficiently powerful to inflict damage to this bridge. I thought, and I predicted, that the US would supply them, but up to now they have not done so. And I suspect that there are all kinds of reasons for that. Perhaps there's genuine fears that this might result in Russian retaliation. Perhaps the Russians have quietly told the US that if such missiles are deployed supplied to Ukraine, Russia will retaliate with missile strikes beyond Ukraine's borders. That would be a massive escalation. Anyway, it would be understandable if the United States, in the face of those kind of warnings, might have decided that the risk of supplying these missiles is simply too great. Anyway, regardless, so far they've not been provided. One missile got through, has done more damage to the roadway. It's postponed the reopening of the bridge it's done some damage to some of the repair equipment, but I suspect that the Russians will get back to work and the road surface will be repaired, and the Ukrainians will at that point no doubt have to launch more of these expensive missiles, of which they've already complained they don't have enough to try to destroy this bridge. It may be that this isn't particularly cost effective. But having said that, it might make some sense if this bridge really was as important to Ukraine in cutting off supplies to the Russian forces west of the Dnieper as the Ukrainians claim. But is this really true? Well, the Russians have apparently built 2 pontoon bridges and are sending their supplies across the Dnieper, some supplies to across the Dnieper to their troops west of the Dnieper across these pontoon bridges. We don't hear very much about these bridges, and I should say the nature of pontoon bridges is that a single missile strike is probably not going to be enough to do serious damage. The Russians can probably replace these any damaged parts of these bridges very quickly, pontoon bridges, because the way these bridges are built is modular. So if one segment is damaged, you can quickly replace it with another. You have to launch constant missile and artillery strikes on these pontoon bridges in order to destroy them. And it seems that Ukraine simply doesn't have this capability. And nearer to Kherson city itself, the Russians are operating a ferry, though that seems to be used principally for civilian traffic until the Antonovsky Bridge is reopened. Now that begs the question, as I said, of how important the Antonovsky Bridge actually is. Now, I have to say, I haven't yet seen any film or pictures of military traffic, Russian military traffic, crossing the Antonovsky Bridge at any time. Now, that doesn't mean that that hasn't happened. Probably it has. Probably it did take place in March when the Russians captured Kherson city. But, as I said, I haven't seen that happen recently. And I've been thinking a little about this issue, and I would stress again that I'm not a military tactician. I have no experience in military matters, but I do understand a little about logistics. Now, it seems to me that the Russians would be able to use artillery pretty effectively against any Ukrainian offensive towards Kherson region with artillery forces that they had deployed east of the Dnieper River. In other words, Russian long-range artillery could do its job shelling these Ukrainian troops trying to advance on Kherson city, even if, because of restrictions in supply, they could not transport artillery across these damaged bridges on pontoon bridges west of the Dnieper. You could continue to do it. Where the Russians might have problems if all these bridges were destroyed would be if they wanted to advance on places like Kryvyi Rog, Nikopol, Nikolaev, or indeed ultimately Odessa itself. The Russians would need to advance their artillery with their troops, and of course that would mean that they would need to resupply their artillery with a constant stream of shells and ammunition. And anybody who knows anything about artillery shells knows that these are bulky items. They're expended in massive quantities in these battles. As I've said previously, in battles in the Donbass, the Russians have sometimes launched between 6,000 and 7,000 shells a day at places like Rubizhnoye and Pesky, which they've been seeking to capture, relatively small places, in other words. So they would need masses of shells to support their artillery in the event of an advance on Nikopol or Kryvyi Rog or on Nikolaev. And probably that would be difficult to do, to supply artillery shells in these kind of massive quantities across pontoon bridges. You'd presumably need a real bridge, a proper bridge, in order to keep supplying your artillery with the necessary amount of ammunition if you were to continue advances in that sort of way. However, you would probably, if you were the Russians and you were expending artillery at the rate that the Russians do expend artillery, you would probably not be transporting all this artillery by road. Because again, given the amount of artillery you're using, the sheer quantity of shells you'd have to move closer to the front lines would be enormous, because what you'd be doing, you'd be bringing tens, probably hundreds of thousands of artillery shells in order to sustain an offensive. You'd then put them in ammunition depots, those shells, various ammunition depots behind the front lines, and then you'd arrange a system with trucks to move the shells backwards and forwards to the front lines, to the artillery people on the front lines. But you'd want your ammunition depots reasonably close to the front lines so that you could send the trucks moving backwards and forwards without needing to refill with diesel, and you'd be able to keep, in that case, a constant supply chain operating. By contrast, if you were sending ammunition from Russia all the way to Kherson, then you wouldn't want to do it by road. You wouldn't want to use trucks for that kind of purpose, because you'd be moving hundreds of thousands of heavy shells and be massively expensive to do. It would cost huge amounts of, you'd require a huge amount of diesel, and of course you'd use you'd have to use huge numbers of trucks to do it. It just isn't effective. It doesn't make a great deal of sense. You'd be sending this ammunition by train, by rail. That's the obvious way for sending vast amounts of artillery shells and ammunition to the frontline troops. You'd be sending them by train. The trains would go to a stop place behind the front lines. They'd then be discharged there, their shells there. The shells would then be sent out to the various places by truck. Ammunition dumps would be created. These would be heavily hardened to protect against artillery fire and missile attack. You'd have air defenses to prevent strikes against these ammunition depots. And then, as I said, those ammunition depots, the trucks would go backwards and forwards and would be sending the shells to supply the artillery. That's presumably how it's done. Now, that means that you would not be using the Antonovsky Bridge to transfer your artillery shells to the frontline troops, to the artillery forces that would be accompanying the frontline troops. You would be using the railway bridge at Novaya Kharkova across the Dnieper. And of course the railway bridge is built on top of the dam. The dam, as we have repeatedly been told, has suffered only superficial damage. Repairing railway bridges or railway tracks, by the way, is much simpler and faster to do than repairing road surfaces, for all kinds of reasons. I'm not going to go into details about that here. It's most unlikely that any of the HIMARS missile strikes we've heard about so far against the Antonovsky Bridge or against any of the other bridges, have in fact limited Russian supplies of artillery to their frontline troops, artillery shells to their frontline troops in any significant way. Because, as I said, most of that ammunition logically must pass across the road bridge. So I'm guessing that the Russians have probably used the Antonovsky Bridge to a great extent for civilian traffic to Kherson, by which I mean, keeping Kherson supplied with food and all of those kind of things. And by the way, to the best of my knowledge, despite a claim from the British Ministry of Defence about a week ago, there's not been any significant shortages of food or other supplies in Kherson city, which suggests that despite the problems at the Antonovsky Bridge, the ferry system is working reasonably well. It's keeping Kherson supplied with the food and other supplies that it needs, and probably food is also being supplied across some of the pontoon bridges. And the pontoon bridges themselves are probably being used to send the trucks, the tanks, the armoured vehicles, those kind of things across when they're needed. So the major bridge is the railway bridge. And note that the railway bridge only becomes a significant point of vulnerability for the Russians, not if they're defending Kherson city, but if they're advancing. Because if it's only a question of defence, then they can probably make do by keeping most of their artillery east of the Dnieper. They would have to deploy their artillery west of the Dnieper if they were to advance on places like Nikolaev, Kryvyi Rog or Nikopol, but they would not, it seems to me, need their artillery west of the Dnieper if it was simply a case of defending Kherson city. The Ukrainian formations, the ones that would have to cross the steppe land to reach Kherson city, they would be within artillery range of Russian artillery, even if that was located east of the Dnieper River. So a vast amount of cost spent to damage bridges which may not have quite the significance that people, officials, military people in Ukraine, perhaps in London, where I suspect this great plan for this Kherson offensive has originated, perhaps not quite as effective as they perhaps think. Well, this is a rather complicated discussion. As I said, it's not, it seems to me, based on, I'm not straying here into the field of military tactics, at least not to any deep extent. This is based on my knowledge of logistics. Anybody who's dealt with logistics knows that if you're going to carry vast amounts of very heavy goods, the way to do it is either by ship or by rail, not by road, unless you absolutely have to, and then doing it by road is extremely expensive and extremely demanding on your trucks, and you need huge numbers of trucks to do it in the necessary, on the necessary scale to shift the amount of ammunition, heavy ammunition you would need in order to sustain an offensive against places like Nikolaev or Kryvyi Rog or Nikopol. Anyway, that's where we are. So, on the Donbass front lines, returning to the main battle, my impression is that yesterday was a quieter day. The military summary channel says that there's been no significant advances on that day. I suspect, as the military summary channel guesses, that what's happening is that the Russians, having made significant gained significant ground over the last 2 weeks, that they're now in the process of consolidating that ground, moving forward their short-range artillery, their mortars, and those sort of things which are going to be needed to break down their Ukrainian fortifications, the further Ukrainian fortifications, bring in some of their Terminator tanks, these very strange looking tanks that are used in attacking troops embedded in built up areas. That's probably part of what the Russians are doing, and as the military summary channel suggested, also rotating troops. The Russians seem to rotate troops every 2 to 3 weeks, moving away their troops from the front lines, taking them back to the rear, giving them rest, reinforcing the units with fit and recovered men, tending to the wounded, doing all those sort of things. So probably yesterday, possibly today as well, will be days of rest until the next advance comes. And that's probably going to start to happen towards the end of this week. And the next week, we will see further advances, I predict, in Donbass, even as the Ukrainians are now in the position of juggling their forces from one front to the other. They're no longer strong enough to be strong in every place, so they're trying to move forces from one place to another as they seek desperately to plug the gaps that the Russians are making. Meanwhile, more problems economically in the West. Europe continues to face the prospect of a very cold winter. The former Labour Chancellor, Gordon Brown, has spoken of the need for an emergency budget in Britain to get through the winter. I'm not quite sure what he is thinking needs to happen. I think he's talking about providing people with extra money to get through the winter to pay their bills. The risk of doing that is that it's going to crank up inflation even higher. And by the way, and for the record, my view about the latest package that's passed through Congress and which is going to no doubt get President Biden's signature shortly, the one that Senator Manchin agreed to, my guess is that that's actually going to be inflationary in its effect as well, and that it seems to me that it demands extra spending and higher taxes, and I would have thought this is not really the way to address the problems the United States is facing at this time. I think it's going to add more upward pressure to inflation rather than bring inflation down, even though somewhat bizarrely this is called an anti-inflation package. It's the Inflation Reduction Act or something of that nature. But anyway, that's where we are. Economic problems mounting, criticism of the Zelensky government in the West mounting. I would say that, in my opinion, the amnesty report that many people have talked about is not part of the pattern of growing criticism of the Zelensky government that we see appearing in various Western newspapers and off the record from Western officials. I think this is a genuine report carried out by some of Amnesty's field workers. I share the criticisms that have been made of Amnesty by many people, but I should also say that I have a very high opinion of some of Amnesty's field workers, people I know, who are not people who run things from the offices in London and elsewhere. They're the people on the ground, and they're the people who work hard and look at the photos and come up with these reports, and I think that is the nature of this report. Amnesty is a more complex organisation than some people understand, though I, again, repeat, that it's not to give it a clean pass. I share many of the criticisms. In fact, I endorse many of the criticisms that I make of it. And with every cycle of conflict, to my mind, the situation with amnesty gets worse. But every so often, you still get good reports coming out of it. And this one, though far from being a good report in its entirety, it says many things I don't agree with. Overall, some of its findings, it seems to me, are reliable and are published in good faith. Elsewhere, more criticism of the Zelensky government, mounting criticism of the Zelensky government, as I suspect people in the West are becoming increasingly worried and disillusioned, and as the prospect of this great Kherson offensive that was going to change the entire situation in Ukraine and give people in the West hope that all the sacrifices being made for Ukraine are not in vain, that great Kherson offensive, the prospects for it fade away. Anyway, that's where we are today. This is my own understanding of the situation. Obviously, more things going on in the world, continued exercises, military exercises by China in and around Taiwan, economic problems in many places, stresses in Ecuador, in Panama, economic problems multiplying around the world. But as I've said many times, up to this point, Ukraine remains the focus of the war, of the conflict, of the general crisis, and that's why my updates remain focused upon it. So thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, locals above all, but also Rumble, ODYSEE, and our Telegram channel, which has been doing extraordinarily well. And links under this video, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar as well. Links under this video also. Remember, you can also go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our t-shirts, our hats, hoodies, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.